They handed her a rifle and expected her to embarrass herself. That was the plan. That was the joke. 53 of the Army's sharpest long-range shooters standing on the evaluation line at Camp Redstone, Nevada. And then there was Sergeant Avery Knox, the only woman in the field, pulling her gear from a standard-issue duffel while men around her traded smirks like baseball cards. Captain Nolan Briggs didn't bother hiding it. He walked straight to her station, picked up her precision rifle off the bench, and held it like evidence of something wrong. "Who authorized this?" he said. Not to her, to the air. Nobody answered. Nobody had to. The laughter said enough. What they didn't know, what none of them could have calculated, was that Avery Knox had already done the math on every single one of them, and she never missed. If you're new here, subscribe now and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will hit you like a round at 1-800 meters. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The bus from McCarran rolled into Camp Redstone just before Yo 500, and the desert was still black. Avery Knox had been awake for the last 4 hours of the drive, not from nerves, but from habit. She sat in the second-to-last row with her ruck between her boots and a small laminated card on her knee, atmospheric data tables she'd printed herself before leaving Fort Bragg, updated with 3-day forecasts for the Mojave Basin. The man sitting across the aisle had been snoring since Utah. His name tape read, Callaway. He'd spend most of the next 6 weeks convinced he was the best shooter in the evaluation pool. Avery folded the card and put it in her chest pocket. The bus stopped. The lights came on. Someone near the front groaned. "Welcome to the sandbox," said the driver. He didn't sound like he meant it as a welcome. She was the 9th person off. She noticed that before anything else, who moved fast, who stretched first, who immediately started scanning the layout of the compound. Old habit. She'd learned early that you learn more in the first 60 seconds of a new environment than in the next 60 minutes. Camp Redstone wasn't much. A central range facility with a cluster of prefab buildings set against a ridge of basalt rock to the northwest. 2 observation towers. A motor pool. A long administrative structure with fluorescent lights already burning inside. The range itself stretched east, and even in the darkness she could make out the silhouettes of target frames at distance, the farthest ones barely visible even when she squinted. She picked up her duffel and her rifle case and walked toward the in-processing table without being told where it was. Knox. The staff sergeant behind the table didn't look up. He ran his finger down a printed roster. Avery M? That's right. He looked up then, just for a second. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A tiny recalibration, the kind people do when reality doesn't match whatever picture they'd already built. "Bunk assignments in the packet," he said. "Range brief at 0630. Don't be late." "I won't be." She took the packet and walked. The barracks building assigned to the evaluation candidates was a long, low structure that smelled like industrial cleaner and old wood. Avery found her bunk, second from the end in a bay of 12, and spent 10 minutes organizing her gear before the first shift of fluorescent lights kicked on overhead. There were 3 other women assigned to the evaluation. She knew this from the roster she'd reviewed before arrival. 2 of them were already in the bay when she got there. Staff Sergeant Denise Farrow from the 10th Mountain, and a Ranger-tabbed corporal named Yates, who introduced herself as Tasha and immediately went back to sleep. The third, a signals specialist named Okonkwo, arrived 40 minutes later and took the bunk on the opposite end. No one talked much. That was fine. By 0600, Avery had her kit laid out, her rifle case under the bunk, and was sitting on her footlocker with the atmospheric card back on her knee, updating her margin notes with a pencil stub. Farrow glanced over. "You do that by hand?" "Yeah." "We're not shooting until the second day." "I know." Farrow watched her for another moment. "Okay," she said finally, and went to tie her boots. The range brief was held in a converted vehicle bay with folding chairs and a projector that kept throwing the image slightly left of center. 63 candidates. Avery counted them, while the evaluation cadre officers took their positions at the front. Captain Nolan Briggs stood at the far right of the cadre line, slightly apart from the others, and said nothing during the opening remarks. He was mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that announced he'd spent years being the most qualified person in any room he walked into. His evaluation lanyard hung straight. His boots were immaculate. He held a metal coffee mug in his left hand and never raised it to his mouth. He was watching the candidates the way someone watches a poker table, reading tells, cataloging people, making decisions he didn't feel the need to share. When his eyes landed on Avery, they stayed for exactly 2 seconds, then moved on. She noted it. The brief covered the 6-week evaluation structure. Week 1. Baseline qualification shoots at standard distance, 600 to 1,000 meters. Week 2 and 3. Field exercises, moving targets, environmental variables introduced. Week 4. Integrated operations, candidate teams, scenario-based problems. Weeks 5 and 6. Final evaluation shoots and designation board. The cadre sergeant major, a compact, weathered man named Devereaux, walked through the scoring rubric with the dry efficiency of someone who'd delivered the same information 24 times and had stopped caring whether anyone wrote it down. Top 12 candidates advance to the designated Marksman pool. The rest go back to their units with a conditional retest date. Any questions? There were a few. Procedural stuff. Nobody asked anything that revealed how they actually thought. Briggs still hadn't moved. Avery raised her hand. Devereaux looked at her. Knox. The wind data you're using for baseline shoots, is that from the tower instrumentation or from the candidate's own collection? A beat of silence. Tower instrumentation, Devereaux said. Standard. Understood. Thank you, Sergeant Major. She put her hand down. Briggs's eyes came back to her, slower this time. She didn't look at him. The first day was administrative. Medical checks, weapons qualification for safety protocols, equipment inventory. The actual shooting started on day 2. By mid-morning of day 1, Avery had already identified the fault line. It happened during the equipment inspection in a covered staging area near the main range building. The candidates were laid out their long rifles for cadre review, bolt-action precision rifles, most of them M24 variants or MK13s, a handful of candidates with platform preferences they'd negotiated through their units. Avery had brought a modified Remington 700 and 300 Winchester Magnum with a Night Force optic she'd adjusted over 3 years of deliberate practice. The man who'd been snoring on the bus, Calloway, stopped when he reached her station. That's your personal weapon? It's the platform I qualified on, she said, cleared through the evaluation guidelines. I know it's cleared. He picked it up without asking, just lifted it off the mat and turned it over, studying the stock configuration, the suppressor adapter. Different. It fits the conditions I've been training for. He set it down. Where you coming from? Bragg. Unit? Ranger support element. Calloway nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant he was filing the information somewhere it could be used later. You shoot competitively? No. Huh. He looked at the rifle again. Lot of custom work for someone who doesn't compete. She met his eyes. I work. He moved on. The dynamic shifted at 14:30. Captain Briggs had been moving through the staging area for the better part of an hour, doing a slow circuit of candidate stations, exchanging brief words with some, nothing with others. When he reached Avery's station, he didn't speak. He picked up her rifle, the second person to do it without asking, and studied it with the same deliberate pace Calloway had used. Then he carried it to the steel bench at the center of the staging area and set it down. Not handed it back. Set it down, on the bench, away from her. This your issue platform? He said. Approved evaluation platform, sir. It's on my intake documentation. I see that. He wasn't looking at the documentation. He was looking at the rifle. Who cleared the suppressor adapter? Master Sergeant Reeves. Range coordination, sir. You'll find the approval stamp on page 4 of the intake packet. Briggs picked up the packet from the nearby clipboard board and made a show of paging through it. When he got to page 4, he looked at it for about 3 seconds longer than it should have taken to read a single stamp. Fine, he said. He set the packet down and walked away. He didn't move the rifle back. There was a half-beat of silence in the staging area. Not complete quiet. Conversations were still happening nearby. But the immediate vicinity had that particular stillness that forms when people are pretending they didn't see something. Avery picked up the rifle herself, placed it back on her station mat, made sure the muzzle was pointed downrange. From across the space, she heard a short, low laugh. She didn't look for the source. Two candidates near the entrance had been watching. She clocked them. Names unknown, but faces logged. They went back to their own gear quickly. Not embarrassed, entertained. She picked up her pencil and went back to her margin notes. Master Sergeant Grant Holloway arrived on the second morning with no announcement. He wasn't listed on the evaluation cadre roster. He showed up at the range at 0545, while most candidates were still at chow, and stood at the observation point behind the 800-meter line with a spotting scope and a notepad. He was somewhere in his late 40s, lean in the way that comes from years of physical maintenance rather than youth, with a gray stripe through his hair that he'd clearly stopped caring about some time ago. Avery noticed him because she was already on the range. She'd been there since 0510. The official first qualification shoot wasn't until 0800, but the range was technically open from 0500 for dry fire and position work. She was lying in the prone behind her rifle, working through a breathing sequence with no ammunition loaded, watching the target frames at 800 meters shift subtly in the pre-dawn wind. Holloway didn't say anything to her. He just opened his spotting scope and did his own watching. She ran 3 dry fire cycles, adjusted her position by 2 inches based on how the wind was behaving in the left side corridor, and stood up at 0600 to check her data card. "You're accounting for the thermal inversion," he said. She looked at him. "The air's going to shift around 0730, temperature gradient off the basalt." He looked at the ridge to the northwest without expression. "What are you projecting?" 2 to 3 mph increase southwest, then it'll flatten once the sun gets above the ridge. Most people won't notice that until it's already affected their first string. "I know." He looked at her then. Just a look. Not a compliment, not a question. The look of someone recalibrating. "You're Knox," he said. "Yes, Sergeant Major." "Grant Holloway. I'm here as a brigade observer." He closed his scope. "Don't tell anyone I'm impressed. I'll deny it." He walked back toward the observation point, and she turned back to her data card. It was the closest thing to a compliment she would receive for the next 9 days. The qualification shoots began at 0800. The system was straightforward, 5-shot strings at increasing distances, scored on group size and time. 600, 800, 1,000 meters. Environmental conditions logged by tower instrumentation. Candidates fired in assigned order. Avery was 17th in rotation. She used the weight productively. The wind had shifted exactly when she'd predicted. At 0728, a slight increase from the southwest, flattening by 0810 as the sun cleared the ridge. She updated her firing solution and didn't touch it again. When her turn came, she settled into the prone, ran through her pre-shot ritual, an 8-second breath cycle, trigger finger discipline check, sight picture confirmation, and fired her first string, 5 rounds, 600 meters. The group measured at 0.6 minutes of angle. The range NCO didn't say anything. He wrote down the number. At 800 meters, she shot a 0.7 MOA group. At 1,000 meters, in a wind that had shifted twice since the morning lull, she shot 0.8. The scores weren't spectacular by the standards of professional long-range shooting, but in a field qualification environment, under standard conditions, with no follow-up allowed, they were exceptional, clean, disciplined, consistent across the full string. Calloway shot after her. He had a 0.9 MOA group at 600 meters and a 1.1 at 1,000. He was good. He knew he was good. He didn't seem particularly interested in her scores, but someone had been keeping track. During the lunch break, Avery was back at the staging area, reviewing her data card, when she overheard 2 candidates talking near the equipment wall. Knox put up a 0.8 at 1,000. "Who's Knox?" A pause. "The woman, with the Remington." A short silence. "She get lucky?" "Twice?" Another pause, longer this time. Avery turned a page on her data card and kept reading. Oh. It was on the 4th day that Briggs made his move. The morning had been a field problem, candidates operating in 2-person teams, navigating to hides in designated terrain sectors, establishing positions, and engaging targets at unknown distances. Avery was paired with a quiet, methodical corporal named DeSantis, who communicated in efficient half-sentences and didn't waste time. They had the best combined time on the hide establishment portion. Avery had ranged the primary target at 1,140 meters using terrain association before DeSantis had finished setting up the spotting scope, and her first-round hit confirmed the range. They were back at the exfil point 6 minutes ahead of the next best team. Briggs was at the after-action debrief. Knox, DeSantis. He was standing at the front of the assembled group, and he gestured to them without warmth. "Walk us through your ranging solution." DeSantis started to speak, but Avery responded first. "We used terrain feature association to establish an initial estimate, mapped the ridgeline break to a known reference on the ground sketch, cross-referenced against the scale, and got a working range of 1,138 meters. Confirmed on first shot." "You didn't use the laser rangefinder?" "The rangefinder was in my kit, sir. I opted for terrain association because the atmospheric haze was likely to introduce a return error at that distance. I wanted a clean solution." Briggs looked at her for a moment. "That's a gamble. It's a calculated decision based on conditions. What if you were wrong? Then I would have confirmed with the laser after the first shot and adjusted, but I wasn't wrong." The room was quiet. Not hostile, just listening. A few of the candidates were writing in their notebooks. Briggs moved on without another word. But that evening, after chow, when Avery returned to the barracks bay, she found a note on her bunk, handwritten on a torn piece of notebook paper. "Tomorrow's physical evaluation is going to be more demanding than the brief indicated. You might want to prepare." No signature. She folded the note and put it in her jacket pocket. She ran 4 miles before lights out. The physical evaluation the next morning included a timed ruck march, 12 miles, 50 pounds, in under 3 hours, added without warning to the original schedule. The cadre presented it as a field preparedness assessment. Half the candidates complained on the march. Calloway did it in 2 hours 54 and looked proud of himself. Avery finished in 2 hours 48. Briggs was at the finish line with a clipboard. When she crossed, he looked at the time, wrote it down, and said nothing. She went to refill her water bottle. Wrong. What Avery didn't let anyone see was the cost. Her right shoulder had been damaged 4 years ago, a training accident that had left a partially torn rotator cuff that she'd rehabbed twice and that still occasionally reminded her it existed. The ruck march, with 50 pounds on a frame pack, had woken it up by mile 7. She'd adjusted her carry position slightly, shifting the weight distribution, keeping the strap tension off the joint, and had not slowed down. Back in the bay that evening, she sat on her footlocker with her shoulder against a tennis ball. She pressed into the junction between her deltoid and trapezius, rolling out the adhesion, working through the soreness methodically. Farrell walked in halfway through and didn't comment. Yates, on the opposite end, glanced over once and went back to her book. Tasha Yates had the kind of economy of expression that Avery respected. She said less than she knew, which was almost always the right approach. "Briggs," Yates said without looking up from her book. "Yeah. He did the same thing to Harrigan last cycle. Different pretense." She turned a page. "Harrigan withdrew voluntarily. Shoulder injury." Avery pressed the tennis ball in deeper and breathed through the discomfort. "Good to know." "He's patient," Yates said. "He waits for the moment when someone's already tired. Then he adds one more thing." "How do you know about the last cycle?" "Denise Farrow was there." Yates finally looked up. "She made it through. Barely. Wouldn't tell me the specifics, but she said it got personal." Avery took the tennis ball away from her shoulder and flexed her fingers. The joint ached. A 7 out of 10, maybe. Manageable. "Did Briggs ever find a reason to pull Farrow's authorization?" "No." "Then he's not after authorization." She put the tennis ball in her kit bag. "He's after confidence. He wants to see who breaks." Yates was quiet for a moment. "And I'm not going to." Yates looked at her for another second, then went back to her book. "Good," she said, in the same flat tone she used for everything else. 9 days in, something changed. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like the slow rotation of a dial, almost imperceptible in any given hour, but obvious when you stepped back and measured across days. The scores were public, posted on the board outside the Range Administration Building each morning after the previous day's data was compiled. Avery checked them the same way she checked her atmospheric data, not for validation, but for information. After 9 days, Knox, A, 94.7, composite. Calloway, 91.2. The next 4 names were bunched between 88 and 90. The first time her name appeared at the top of the board, 3 candidates stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. Then one of them, she didn't catch his name tape, said something low to the other 2, and they walked away. That afternoon at the range, 2 candidates who had previously not acknowledged her existence asked her a question about wind reading during a break in firing. She answered them. Then Holloway appeared at her shoulder like he'd materialized from the basalt. "You know they're going to start watching you differently now," he said quietly. "I know. That's going to change how Briggs approaches the last weeks." She was watching the target frames at distance, gauging the flag behavior. "How so?" "He can't ignore the numbers. He'll shift strategies." Holloway was quiet for a moment. "He'll start looking for something operational to challenge, judgment under pressure, decision-making in complex scenarios, something where the metric isn't as clean." "He can look," she said. "I know he can." He picked up his spotting scope. "I'm telling you because I want you to be ready when it happens." She turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time. "Why?" Holloway was quiet for a moment. He adjusted the focus on his scope. "Because in 31 years, I've seen 14 soldiers with your kind of preparation. 3 of them got where they deserved to go. The rest got ground down before they could get there." He didn't look at her. "I'm tired of watching it happen." She held his gaze for a moment. "Understood, Sergeant Major." He nodded and walked back to the observation point. But the thing about precision shooting, the thing that most people outside the community never quite grasped, was that the physical act of pulling the trigger was the smallest part of the job. Anyone could pull a trigger. Millions of people pulled triggers every year. The real work was everything that happened before the trigger. The reading, the calculation, the waiting. The ability to sit in a static position for hours without losing the acuity to solve a firing problem in the 6 seconds that actually mattered. Avery had known this since she was 22, lying in a hide box at Fort Benning with a ranger instructor sitting 4 feet away asking her atmospheric questions while she tried to maintain her sight picture through sustained muscle tension. She'd answered every question. She hadn't moved her crosshair. That was the moment she'd understood that the job was about the mind, not the body, and that the mind could be trained to the same standards as a muscle, given enough deliberate practice. She'd spent 6 years building that practice, not on competition ranges, not in front of audiences, in the early mornings, in the data books, in the quiet accumulation of problems solved and patterns recognized. She'd built something no one had seen yet, because no one had thought to look. Holloway had looked. Now Briggs was starting to look too, not because he wanted to, but because the numbers were forcing his hand. And somewhere in the chain of command above Camp Redstone, there was a deployment window on a calendar. 6 weeks until the 3rd Brigade combat team shipped for a valley in the Carson region that she'd been studying in open-source imagery for the last 3 weeks. She knew things about that terrain that the evaluation board didn't know she knew. She'd been building for this specific moment for longer than anyone in this compound had realized. The rifle was a tool. The data cards were a tool. The evaluation scores were a tool. The real shot, the one that would matter, hadn't been taken yet. And then, on the morning of Day 12, Captain Nolan Briggs walked into the range staging area, looked directly at her from across the room and said, "Knox, my office. Now." The room went quiet in that particular way that meant everyone heard and no one was going to say so. Avery set down her data card, capped her pencil, and walked. Briggs's office was a 12 by 12 room at the back of the range administration building that smelled like coffee grounds and old paper. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard with range schedules written in red marker, and a framed photo of a sniper team on a ridge somewhere dusty that Avery didn't recognize. No window. A single overhead light that buzzed slightly at the left end of its frequency range. Briggs was already behind the desk when she entered. He didn't tell her to sit. She stood. He opened a folder and looked at it for a moment without speaking. She recognized the tactic, the deliberate pause designed to establish who controlled the pace of the conversation. She'd seen senior NCOs use it in counseling sessions. She'd seen it used badly, which made it obvious. Briggs used it well, which meant he'd practiced. "Your composite score is leading the field," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "By 3.5 points." "Yes, sir." He closed the folder. "That concerns me." She kept her face neutral. I'm not sure I understand, sir. It concerns me, he said again, slower, because a score like that in the first 2 weeks of evaluation doesn't always hold. Conditions get harder, problems get more complex. Candidates who look exceptional in controlled environments sometimes fall apart when the variables multiply. Understood, sir. Do you? Yes, sir. The evaluation is designed to test performance under increasing complexity. The early scores are a baseline, not a conclusion. Briggs leaned back in his chair and studied her. The buzzing light filled the silence. You were with the Ranger support element at Bragg for how long? 3 years, sir. Operational deployments? 2. Afghanistan, then a 6-month rotation in the Horn of Africa. Sniper support? Designated marksman role, both deployments. Direct support to assault elements. He nodded slowly. I've seen your file. It's clean. She didn't respond to that. Almost too clean, he said. There it was. She'd been waiting for the shape of it, and now she had it. Sir? Clean files sometimes mean someone's been insulated from situations that would reveal their actual limitations. He wasn't aggressive about it, just flat, matter of fact, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow. I've seen it before. Soldiers who perform well in structured environments because their environments have been structured for them. Support elements are good at that, keeping their people in lanes that don't expose the gaps. Avery looked at him steadily. Are you questioning my operational record, sir? I'm questioning whether your operational record accurately reflects your capabilities under genuine pressure. A beat. With respect, sir, she said, the evaluation is designed to answer that question. That's why I'm here. Briggs held her gaze for a moment, then he picked up the folder again. Your endurance metrics from yesterday's ruck were within the top 3. Your marksmanship scores are leading the field. Your field navigation problem was the fastest solution in the rotation. He paused. Which means the only thing I haven't seen yet is how you perform when something goes wrong. I'd expect something to go wrong, sir. That's what field conditions are. That's a confident answer. It's an accurate one. He set the folder down. Dismissed. She turned and left without another word. In the hallway outside his office, she stopped, took one slow breath, and walked back to the staging area. The room was still quiet when she entered. 2 candidates near the gear wall had positioned themselves to see the hallway door. They'd been watching for her return. She picked up her data card, uncapped her pencil, and went back to work. Nobody asked what happened. Nobody had to. That night, after lights out, she lay on her bunk with the darkness pressing flat against the ceiling and ran through the conversation twice, examining it the way she examined atmospheric data, looking for the variable that would shift the equation. Briggs wasn't stupid. That was the thing she had to hold on to. Stupid adversaries were manageable because they moved predictably. Briggs was smart enough to know that direct obstruction would leave a paper trail, and smart enough to work around it. He wasn't trying to fail her. He was trying to create conditions under which she would fail herself. The difference mattered. She rolled onto her side. Her shoulder ached in the low background way it always did at night. A 7 becoming a 5, livable, ignorable if she didn't focus on it. She focused on the wind patterns instead. The second week introduced moving targets. The mechanical system at Redstone was a track and rail setup running at variable speeds across the 600 and 800 meter lines, with targets presenting for 3 to 5 second windows before dropping behind berm cover. The speed varied without pattern, which meant leading solutions couldn't be pre-calculated. They had to be read in real time off the target's movement, applied instantaneously, and fired within the presentation window. It was the closest thing to genuine snap shooting that a precision rifle qualification could engineer. Most of the top candidates handled it adequately. Callaway had a tight first-round hit rate on the 600-meter track, but dropped to 68% at 800. He looked annoyed about it in the way that people look annoyed when a thing they expected to be easy turns out to require actual adjustment. Avery's first-round hit rate across both distances was 81%. She wasn't perfect. She dropped 2 shots in the first string, a slight miscalculation on a target that accelerated unexpectedly mid-presentation, and a wind gust at the wrong moment on her third string that she hadn't fully read in time. She noted both, wrote the corrections into her data card during the break, and didn't drop another shot in the afternoon session. The range NCO, Staff Sergeant Kowalski, a veteran of 3 previous evaluation cycles who'd developed the specific facial expression of a man who'd stopped being surprised by anything. Wrote her numbers down and didn't say anything unusual. But she caught him looking at her board twice during the afternoon session, which was twice more than he looked at anyone else's. Holloway was at the observation point for both the morning and afternoon sessions. He said nothing to her directly. When she passed him on the way to resupply ammunition, he was writing in his notebook. She caught a partial glimpse, not intentionally, just proximity, and saw a column of numbers that looked like her hit rates, annotated with times. I was building his own record. She filed that away and kept walking. The team problems in Week 2 were designed to introduce friction. 2-person elements, assigned without candidate input, given objective packages with incomplete information and limited time to develop solutions. Avery was paired with a different partner this time, a staff sergeant named Murakami from the 82nd Airborne, quiet, thorough, with the particular patience of someone who'd spent time in reconnaissance roles and had learned to tolerate uncertainty without filling the silence with noise. The problem they received was a degraded communication scenario. Establish a firing position on objective Kilo, engage 2 targets at unknown distances using only terrain estimation and weather observation, exfil before a simulated QRF arrived. No laser rangefinder, no tower data feeds, 45 minutes. They made it in 38. Murakami handled the exfil navigation while Avery solved the fire problem. Their debrief lasted 7 minutes because there wasn't much to explain. The solution was clean, the logic was documented, and the results matched the intent. The cadre evaluator for that problem was a lieutenant colonel named Ashford, who wasn't part of the regular evaluation staff, and who asked 3 questions at the debrief that were significantly more technical than the standard rubric required. Avery answered all 3. Ashford wrote something in a separate notebook, not the standard evaluation form. She noted it, didn't comment. The friction with Briggs didn't stop. It just changed texture. He stopped making visible moves. No more taking her rifle off the station, no more pointed questions in front of the group. Instead, he worked through scheduling. Avery found herself assigned to the earliest firing slots on cold mornings, when the barrel temperature differential was highest and fouling patterns were least predictable. She was put in team problems with partners who had different methodologies than hers, requiring more negotiation time. During debrief sessions, Briggs asked her more follow-up questions than he asked anyone else. Not hostile questions, but exhausting ones, the kind that required her to justify every decision at every decision point with technical precision while the rest of the candidates watched. She answered them, every time. DeSantis pulled her aside after one particularly long debrief session. "He's doing it on purpose," DeSantis said, low, walking beside her toward the barracks. "I know. You should say something, to Holloway, or to the IG rep." "And say what?" She glanced at him. "That an officer is asking me too many questions? That I'm being scheduled for early slots?" She shook her head. "That's not a complaint, that's just Tuesday." DeSantis was quiet for a moment. "It's wearing you down. It's giving me practice." He looked at her like he didn't quite believe that. She didn't push it. It was partly true and partly not, and she wasn't going to pull that thread in the open. What she didn't tell DeSantis, what she didn't tell anyone, was that the planning room was getting full. The planning room was what she'd started calling the corner of the barracks bay around her footlocker, though it wasn't a room and there was no privacy. She'd commandeered a section of wall-mounted wire shelving that had been empty since arrival, and built a working surface out of a plywood offcut she'd found behind the motor pool. On it, her data cards, organized by date and condition. Printed atmospheric tables updated from the Regional Weather Service data. She was pulling off a shared terminal in the admin building during early morning access hours. Handwritten trajectory models for 3 different cartridge weights at distances from 800 to 2,000 meters. The 2,000-meter work wasn't for the evaluation. She'd started it because of the Carson Valley imagery she'd been studying on the same shared terminal. Open-source satellite data, publicly accessible. The kind of thing that any soldier with time and motivation could pull up. The valley terrain was distinctive, a compressed drainage running northeast-southwest, surrounded by ridgelines that created a predictable thermal column behavior in the pre-dawn hours. The kind of terrain where an elevated firing position could dominate a wide engagement area. If the shooter understood what the atmosphere was doing at that hour, at that altitude, in that season. She didn't know exactly why she was building this. Not yet. It was more instinct than plan. The recognition of a problem that hadn't been formally presented, but that felt like it was coming. She built the models anyway. Preparation was never wasted. If the information turned out to be irrelevant, she'd lost a few hours of sleep. If it turned out to be relevant, she'd already done the hard work. Pharaoh noticed the plywood board on day 15. She stopped in front of it on her way to her bunk, coffee mug in hand, and looked at the trajectory tables for a long moment. Is that what I think it is? Depends what you think it is. Ballistic solution modeling, for distances past the evaluation ceiling. Yeah. Pharaoh looked at her. For where? Avery met her eyes. I'm not sure yet. Pharaoh looked at the board for another moment, then took a drink of her coffee. The Carson deployment, she said. Not a question. Avery didn't answer. Pharaoh nodded slowly. 3rd Brigade's been on the operational calendar for 2 months. It's not exactly classified. She looked at the trajectory tables again. You're preparing for a shot that hasn't been assigned. I'm preparing for conditions that are likely. That's either brilliant or paranoid. Usually both. Pharaoh gave a short, quiet laugh. Not dismissive, genuinely amused, and went to her bunk. Day 17. The evaluation calendar had reached its midpoint, which meant the composite rankings were posted in full for the first time. Not daily scores, but the complete cumulative standing of all 63 candidates. Avery stood in front of the board at 0545 and read it. She didn't spend long. She found what she needed in the first 30 seconds. Knox, A. 94.2. First, Callaway, 90.8. Second, Murakami, 89.4. Third, the gap between her and the second-place candidate was 3.4 points. In an evaluation this dense, that was significant. It wasn't insurmountable. The back half of the evaluation weighted field judgment more heavily than raw marksmanship, which created room for the gap to close. But it was real. She was reading the lower end of the board when Callaway appeared beside her. He stood there for a moment, looking at the top of the list. You've been at this a while, he said. 6 years in the role. Designated marksman the whole time? Most of it. Some reconnaissance work. He nodded. He wasn't hostile. That surprised her slightly. He had the quality of someone who was competitive rather than threatened, which was different. Your moving target numbers are better than mine, he said, like he was acknowledging a fact about weather. Your group size at 600 is tighter. Yeah, he scratched the back of his neck. I'm a better static shooter than a dynamic one, always have been. He looked at the board again. You don't have that problem. She looked at him. Neither problem is fatal. No. He turned away from the board. Good luck with the back half. She watched him go. He meant it, she could tell that. It didn't make him an ally, but it made him something slightly more useful than an adversary. The day the brigade evaluator found her planning board wasn't something she'd planned. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford had come back for a second visit on day 19, again unannounced, again with his separate notebook, and had apparently taken a wrong turn looking for Sergeant Major Devereaux's office. He'd ended up in the barracks bay in the 60 seconds between when Avery left for the range and when the bay would have been empty for the morning. She found out what happened from Pharaoh. He stood there for about 4 minutes, Pharaoh said, voice low, the two of them walking toward the chow hall. Just reading, didn't touch anything. Who told you? Yates. She'd forgotten her data book and doubled back. Avery was quiet for a moment. Did he say anything? Yates said he took out his notebook and wrote something. Then he left. Pharaoh glanced at her. She said he looked like someone who'd found something they weren't expecting to find. Good or bad? She said he didn't look unhappy. Avery processed that. In the hierarchy of vague assessments, didn't look unhappy, from a lieutenant colonel, was meaningfully positive. Did he take photos? Yates didn't see any. Okay. She filed it. Thanks. The field exercise in week 3 was the most complex problem the evaluation had run so far. The scenario: a simulated reconnaissance mission into a designated area of operations, with candidates operating in 4-person teams, establishing observation posts, collecting intelligence data on simulated enemy activity, and reporting findings through a degraded communication protocol that limited radio traffic to short-burst transmissions. Avery's team, Murakami, DeSantis, and a candidate named Oduya, who'd been near the bottom of the composite rankings, but who, it turned out, was a communications specialist with a gift for reading signal environments that made him invaluable in exactly this kind of scenario. The team worked well because everyone brought something the others didn't have. Murakami navigated. DeSantis handled the overwatch element. Oduya managed the communications. Avery built the intelligence picture. The intelligence picture was the problem that absorbed her. The simulated enemy activity in the exercise area had a pattern. Not an obvious one, not the kind that jumped out in a single observation period. But she spent 6 hours in the observation post watching the simulated activity markers move through the terrain, logging timestamps and positions, and by the 4th hour she'd identified something. The activity wasn't random. It was reacting to something. Specifically, it was reacting to the simulated patrol routes that the exercise designers had built into the scenario. Every time the patrol element, played by cadre role players, moved through a particular corridor, the simulated enemy activity shifted 30 to 40 minutes later in a way that suggested advanced knowledge of the patrol's route. She brought it to Murakami quietly. "They're not reacting to contact," she said. "They're predicting movement." Murakami looked at her observation log. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not in the scenario brief." "No, but it's in the data." He looked at the log again, tracing the timestamps with his finger. After a minute, he said, "Compromised route information. Or a pattern that's become predictable enough to function the same way." He looked up. "You're going to put this in the intelligence report?" "Yes." "The evaluators might not be looking for it. It's outside the standard reporting framework." "I know." She held his gaze. "It's accurate." He handed the log back. "Write it up." She did. The intelligence report her team submitted was 11 pages, roughly 4 times the standard length, and included an appendix with the timestamp analysis and a recommended change to patrol route protocols. The cadre evaluator who received it read the first 3 pages at the handoff point and stopped. "Who wrote the appendix?" he said. "I did," Avery said. He looked at her for a moment. "Wait here." He walked away with the report. She waited 22 minutes before he came back. When he returned, Lieutenant Colonel Ashford was with him. Ashford looked at her in the particular way he'd been looking at her since his second visit, like someone reading a document they already knew was going to be significant. "Walk me through the timestamp analysis," he said. She did. 14 minutes. He asked 2 clarifying questions and didn't interrupt her otherwise. When she finished, he closed his notebook and said, "Thank you, Sergeant Knox." She nodded. He walked away. The cadre evaluator looked at her for a moment. "That's an unusual level of analysis for a field exercise report," he said. "The data was there," she said. "I put it in the report." He seemed to think about that for a second. "Yeah," he said. "All right." Word moved through the evaluation compound, the way everything moved through military installations, quietly, selectively, and then all at once. She heard it first from DeSantis, who heard it from a cadre NCO during a range maintenance detail. Something about the field exercise report going up the chain. Something about Ashford making calls. She heard it second from Farrow, who'd been present when 2 senior cadre sergeants had a conversation they probably should have had somewhere more private, and who passed along the gist without embellishment. Knox's intelligence product from the field exercise had been assessed as operationally significant, not just as an evaluation submission, but as a genuine analytical output worth preserving and potentially integrating into pre-deployment preparation materials. She heard it third from Yates, who said nothing except, "Briggs knows." That was the one that mattered. She was at the planning board that evening, updating the Carson Valley trajectory models with new atmospheric data she'd pulled from the regional service, when she felt the change in the bay. Not a sound, a shift in the quality of the silence. She looked up. Briggs was standing in the doorway of the barracks bay. He never came to the barracks. In 19 days, she'd never seen him in the barracks area. Officers didn't generally enter enlisted barracks bays without purpose, and purpose required announcement. He hadn't announced. He looked at her planning board from the doorway, at the trajectory tables, the atmospheric models, the Carson Valley data she hadn't hidden because she'd never expected it to require hiding. He looked at it for maybe 8 seconds. Then he looked at her. She turned to face him. She didn't stand. She was sitting on her footlocker, and standing would have suggested she needed to present herself, and she didn't. That's a lot of work for an evaluation candidate, he said. It's preparation, sir. For the evaluation, she held his gaze. For whatever comes after. He looked at the board again, at the numbers that went past 1,100 meters, at the atmospheric tables that were date-indexed to a seasonal window that started in roughly 6 weeks. She watched him do the math, watched him understand what she'd built and why and how long she'd been building it. His jaw tightened. Just slightly, just once. Then he looked back at her. Lights out is at 2200, he said. Yes, sir? He turned and walked out. The bay was quiet for a long moment. Then, from the far end, Yates turned a page in her book. That was all. But in the morning, when Avery arrived at the range at EO 510, the scheduling board had been changed. Her firing slot for the day's primary qualification shoot, previously the first rotation, the coldest, the most variable, had been moved to the last slot of the morning session. The most favorable conditions of the day. She stood in front of the board and looked at the change for a moment. She didn't know whether it was an olive branch or a setup. With Briggs, it could be either. It could be both. She picked up her data card and went to read the wind. The wind off the Carson Valley came down hard before dawn. It wasn't the clean, readable wind of the Nevada desert. This was something meaner, a variable current that dropped off the eastern ridgeline in unpredictable pulses, running warm at ground level and cold at elevation, reversing direction in the drainage corridors without warning. Avery had been studying it for 11 days. She still didn't fully trust it. That was the thing about this terrain. You could model it. You could build tables and run calculations and account for every atmospheric variable you had the instruments to measure. And then the valley would do something the model didn't predict, because the valley didn't care about models. She'd been in country for 3 weeks when she started seeing the pattern. The 3rd Brigade Combat Team had arrived in the Carson region during the 2nd week of the deployment rotation, moving into a forward operating base that had been established 6 months earlier by the previous unit, and handed over with a stack of intelligence products that ranged from solid to speculation. The terrain was high desert, rocky, cold at night, deceptively warm by midday, cut through with drainage corridors that the locals navigated by memory and outsiders learned to respect slowly or not at all. Avery had finished first in the evaluation. The designation board had been unambiguous about it, 94.2 composite, a margin that left no room for procedural argument, even from Briggs, who'd sat at the board table and said nothing when the results were read. She'd been assigned as the brigade's primary designated marksman, attached to the reconnaissance element under the operational authority of Major Daniel Fitch, a taciturn man from Wyoming who communicated primarily in direct sentences and had the useful quality of trusting data over instinct. Holloway had pulled her aside at the evaluation closing ceremony, the closest thing to ceremony the evaluation ran, which was essentially a 30-second handshake in front of the administration building. "Don't stop building," he'd said. That was all. She hadn't. The FOB was a converted agricultural compound, stone walls, corrugated metal roofing over the main structure, generators running on a rotation that kept the power flickering in the early morning hours. Her assigned workspace was a small room off the main operations center that had previously served as a supply closet and still smelled like diesel and rubber. She'd cleared out the remaining equipment boxes on the first day and replaced them with her planning materials. The trajectory tables were on the left wall. The atmospheric models were on the right. The center was the Carson Valley itself, a hand-drawn terrain sketch she'd built from a combination of topographic maps, satellite imagery, and her own observation notes from 4 patrol accompaniments in the first 2 weeks. She spent the mornings on patrol or at the observation post that the reconnaissance element maintained along the valley's western ridgeline. She spent the evenings at the wall. Major Fitch had come in twice, looked at the wall for a while, and left without commenting. The second time, he'd brought coffee. She'd taken it as a sign that she wasn't about to be told to stop. The intelligence analysts, 2 of them, a young specialist named Torres and a warrant officer named Kelleher, who'd been in the region before, produced their products from the main operations center using the standard framework. Avery read their reports every day. She wasn't being critical. Torres was diligent and Kelleher had good area knowledge. Their products were accurate as far as they went. The problem was where they stopped going. She first noticed the mortar team behavior on day 9. The enemy mortar crews operating in the Carson Valley had been a known factor since the FOB was established. They moved frequently, avoided predictable positions, and generally demonstrated a level of tactical discipline that suggested experienced operators rather than opportunistic ones. The previous unit's intelligence products had flagged 3 confirmed positions and several suspected positions along the eastern ridgeline. What the products hadn't flagged, because the data points were spread across 6 months of patrol logs and no one had laid them all against each other in the right sequence, was that the mortar crews weren't just moving to avoid detection. They were moving in anticipation of patrol routes. The first time she noticed it was a coincidence. She was cross-referencing patrol logs against observation post reports, looking for a firing solution corridor on a suspected mortar position. When she realized that the mortar team had relocated 40 minutes before a patrol element passed through the area they'd been targeting. The timing was wrong for a reaction to contact. You don't have 40 minutes of warning from a patrol element unless you know where it's going. She wrote it down, filed it, looked for it again. She found it 6 more times across 18 separate patrol events in the previous 90 days. 6 out of 18 wasn't conclusive. 12 events that didn't show the pattern could mean she was wrong, or it could mean the information was incomplete, or it could mean the pattern was real but inconsistent, which, in its own way, was more disturbing than consistent. She spent a week building the framework, every patrol in the log, every mortar event, both observed and reported, every timeline, cross-referenced against weather conditions, time of day, patrol route predictability, and communication events. At the end of the week, she had 47 data points and a conclusion that made her stomach drop. The mortar crews had advanced knowledge of American patrol routes. Not always. Not with perfect reliability, but with a frequency that was statistically impossible to attribute to coincidence or exceptional observation skills. Somebody was telling them. Well, she brought it to Major Fitch on a Tuesday morning, 11 days before the patrol cycle that her analysis suggested was the highest risk window. Fitch was at his desk with 3 reports he was already working through. He looked up when she came in. "Knox, what have you got?" She laid the analysis on his desk. 47 data points, the pattern documented, the timeline projection, and the conclusion. He read it. He didn't read it fast. He went through it page by page, and she stood and waited and watched his face do the specific thing that faces do when they're reading something they weren't expecting. Not panic, something quieter. The recalibration of someone competent receiving information that reshapes what they thought they understood. When he finished, he set it down. "You built this yourself," he said. "Yes, sir." "Off the patrol logs and OP reports?" "Yes, sir." "And the previous unit's mortar activity summaries?" He was quiet for a moment. "Kelleher's going to want to see this." "Yes, sir." "He's also going to have questions about the methodology." "I'd expect him to. I'll answer them." Fitch looked at the analysis again. The next high-risk window. 11 days. The rotation schedule has 3 patrol elements moving through the eastern drainage corridor between day 11 and day 14. If the pattern holds, those patrols are compromised before they step off. He leaned back. "What kind of numbers are we talking about on the ground?" The patrol elements average 9 to 12 personnel each. The room was quiet for a moment. "And you think there's an ambush planned?" "I think the mortar crews have been positioning to support one. The last 3 movement events clustered their assets in the upper drainage area. That's not a defensive posture. They're not trying to avoid us. They're trying to get into range of something specific." Fitch stood up. "All right, get Kelleher in here." The meeting with Kelleher went the way she'd expected. Warrant Officer Kelleher was not a hostile man. He was a careful one, which in some respects was harder. He went through her analysis with methodical skepticism, challenging each data point, questioning the sample size, identifying alternative explanations for the pattern. She answered every challenge. Not quickly. Kelleher deserved real answers, and real answers took time. She walked him through the timeline construction, the exclusion criteria she'd used to eliminate coincidental events, the statistical model she'd built to test whether the pattern frequency could be produced by chance. It couldn't. She'd run the numbers 3 ways. The probability of the observed pattern occurring randomly was less than 4%. Kelleher sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I'm not saying you're wrong," he said. "I know. I'm saying this is a significant conclusion that's going to require significant corroboration before it goes up the chain." "What kind of corroboration?" He looked at her. The kind that involves people above my pay grade making decisions about operational security and source assessment. He paused. This implies we have a leak. Yes, sir. It does. The word landed in the room like something physical. Fitch, standing against the wall, said nothing. Kelleher looked at the analysis again. I'll take it up. Today. He met her eyes. This stays in this room until I say otherwise. Understood. It didn't fully stay in the room. She hadn't expected it to. Information like that moved through command channels under its own gravity, and by the following morning she could feel the change in the operations center, the way certain conversations stopped when she walked in, the way Fitch's staff meetings ran 10 minutes longer than usual, the way the communications rotation changed without official announcement. Torres found her at the observation post on day 13 and said simply, Kelleher submitted your analysis to Brigade S2 last night. She'd already assumed that. Okay. They're taking it seriously. He paused. He was young, 23, 24, and had the particular quality of someone who was smart enough to understand the weight of something without fully knowing what to do with it. There's talk about modifying the patrol schedules. Good. And about whether the operation can still go forward. She turned to look at him. Which operation? The one that takes the patrol elements through the eastern drainage. He looked uncomfortable. There's a time-sensitive target in that corridor. Brigade has been working it for weeks. They don't want to pull the patrols. Even with the risk. Even with it. He hesitated. There's talk about whether there's a way to neutralize the threat before the patrols go in. She turned back to the valley. The morning light was cutting across the eastern ridgeline at a low angle, throwing the rock formations into sharp relief. She could see the upper drainage from here, a narrow cleft in the terrain where the ridge broke and the valley floor compressed into a natural funnel. It was a perfect mortar position, and it was a long way away. Well, Major Fitch called her in on day 15. She found him in the operations center with 3 other officers, Captain Briggs, who had deployed with the brigade staff in an advisory capacity and whose presence in the room landed on her like cold water, a lieutenant colonel named Hartman from the brigade operations section, and Kelleher, sitting to one side with his notebook. Briggs looked at her when she entered and looked away. She took the empty chair across from Fitch and waited. We've corroborated the pattern, Fitch said without preamble. Not the source of the compromise, that's an ongoing inquiry, but the behavioral pattern you identified checks out against additional data we pulled from the previous unit's raw signals intercepts. The mortar element in the upper drainage has been repositioning in anticipation of our movements. Yes, sir. Brigade is proceeding with the patrol operation. The time-sensitive target cannot be delayed. He put his hands on the table. We need the mortar threat neutralized before the patrol elements step off, which means we need it done in a 6-hour window, pre-dawn, before the patrols move. She looked at the map on the table. She already knew the terrain. She'd been looking at it for weeks. The confirmed position is here, Hartman said, pointing to the upper drainage on the map. Most recent imagery puts the primary crew at this saddle. She looked at the saddle, measured it against the ridgeline positions she'd been considering for the past 10 days. That's 1,840 meters from the eastern OP, she said. The room was quiet. Give or take, Hartman said. Give or take 30 meters, depending on where exactly in the saddle they're set up. More quiet. Briggs said, That's an extreme range engagement for a designated marksman. She looked at him. He was looking at the map. It's outside the evaluation ceiling, he said. It's outside most doctrine parameters for a non-crew-served platform. It's within the capability of the platform and the firing solution, she said. He looked at her then. Based on what? Based on the trajectory modeling I've been running for the past 3 weeks. She reached into her jacket and set her data card on the table. Atmospheric tables for this terrain and this seasonal window. Ballistic solutions for the 300 Win Mag at 1,800 plus meters under the pre-dawn thermal conditions in the drainage. I've been building this for the specific environmental variables in this valley. The room was very quiet. Fitch looked at the data card, then at her. You built this before you were briefed on this operation. Yes, sir. Before you even arrived in country. The terrain analysis started at Camp Redstone, sir. The conditions were predictable from open-source data. Hartman leaned forward and looked at the data card. He spent about 20 seconds reading it. Then he looked at Kelleher. Kelleher shrugged slightly. The shrug of someone who had stopped being surprised by this particular soldier. Briggs said, "A miss at that range in that corridor tips off the element before the patrols can reposition." "I know," Avery said. "And if they scatter, we lose the position, and the patrols move into an unresolved threat." "I know. So what's your confidence level?" She looked at him directly. "High." "That's not a number." 92%, accounting for the pre-dawn thermal variable in the drainage corridor and the potential for a slight position offset from the imagery. She paused. The 8% is wind behavior in the last 200 meters of the flight path, where the drainage creates a compression effect that's difficult to model precisely without real-time data. Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map, at the data card, at her. "What do you need?" he said. "A spotter who can read thermals in low-light conditions. Full fire authority, no confirmation requirement, because the window will be too short for a radio loop. And I need to be in position no later than Mo 300. Fitch said, "DeSantis is available." "DeSantis works." Fitch looked around the table. Hartman nodded. Kelleher closed his notebook. Briggs looked at the map for a long moment without expression. Then he said, "Knox has fire authority." DeSantis received the brief at 2000 and didn't flinch. That was one of his qualities. He processed information the way a good engine processed fuel, cleanly and completely, without drama. 1,840 meters, he said. Approximately. Pre-dawn. 400 engagement window. The patrol elements step off at 0615. We need the threat neutralized or we need them rerouted, and rerouting costs the time-sensitive target. He nodded slowly. He was looking at her terrain sketch on the wall, the hand-drawn one she'd been building since the first week. "What's the wind doing in the drainage at 0400? "Calm to 2 miles per hour at 0300. It builds after 0430 as the thermal gradient develops. We need to be ready before the build." "And the target position?" "Saddle on the eastern ridgeline. Imagery from 48 hours ago puts the primary crew at the northern end of the saddle, which gives us a slight angle advantage from the OP position." She pointed on the sketch. "If they've moved to the southern end, the engagement geometry changes, but the solution is still viable." "Different firing data." "By about 0.4 mils elevation. I've modeled both." He looked at her. "Of course you have. Do you want to see the cards?" "I want to see everything you've built." She pulled the data cards. They spent 2 hours going through the firing solutions together, working the problem from both ends. DeSantis checking her math, identifying the assumptions, stress testing the variables. He found 2 things she'd accounted for and 1 thing she hadn't. The possibility of a localized fog layer in the drainage corridor in the hour before sunrise, which could affect the intermediate trajectory. "How likely?" she said. 30%, based on the last week's pattern. Fog comes in around 0345, burns off by 0500. She looked at the firing solution. It won't penetrate enough to significantly deflect the round. "Agreed. But it might affect my sight picture for the call. I'll be relying on your verbal on wind, not optics for the correction." "Then we're fine." She put the data card back on the wall. "We're fine," she said. But she said it like someone checking a result they'd already calculated, not like someone reassuring themselves. There was a difference. They moved out at 0215. The route to the eastern OP was a 2-kilometer climb along a goat trail that had no name on any military map, and that Avery had walked 3 times in daylight and once in low-light conditions during a patrol 2 weeks earlier. In full darkness, with no illumination, it was different. The depth perception flattened, the footing became uncertain, the familiar landmarks vanished into the uniform black of the ridge. She led. DeSantis followed 2 meters back, carrying the spotting scope and the radio. Neither of them spoke. The cold was a physical presence. At this elevation, in this season, the pre-dawn temperature in the drainage corridor dropped to near freezing even in what the local seasonal standards called late summer. She'd layered correctly. Wool base, fleece mid, soft shell over. But the chill still found the gaps at her wrists and collar, and by the time they reached the OP position at 0310, her fingers had the stiff, imprecise feeling that she'd have to work out before she could trust her trigger control. She spent 10 minutes on the hands, controlled movement exercises, blood flow, the slow restoration of fine motor function. DeSantis set up the spotting scope and began his initial read of the target area. "I've got thermal activity at the northern saddle," he said, voice barely above a murmur. "Two sources. Could be personnel, could be equipment. Consistency with the crew set up from the imagery? Consistent. One stationary, one moving slightly." She settled into her position. The rifle went into the bipod. She built her cheek weld, acquired the general target area and the scope, and began her pre-engagement sequence. Breathing, heart rate, the slow architectural process of turning a body under stress into a stable firing platform. The valley was completely dark below them, no lights from the drainage. The patrol elements were still at the phobie, 4 hours from stepping off. Somewhere in the upper eastern ridgeline, 2 heat signatures were setting up a weapon that would kill people if it fired. She had 1 round in the chamber. She'd considered using 2, a confirmation shot, a standard practice at extreme range when the wind was uncertain. But the noise protocol required minimum signatures, and at this distance the report would carry. 1 round, clean. She exhaled slowly and checked her data card one more time. 1,838 meters, based on DeSantis's laser range reading. Elevation, 12.4 mils. Wind, 1.2 miles per hour, right to left, 0 at the intermediate point, unknown at the terminal end. Earth's rotation correction, 0.1 mils right, at this latitude and bearing. Temperature differential between firing point and target, 11 degrees. She'd run this calculation 40 times in the last 3 weeks. She ran it once more in her head, checking each variable against the number her hands already knew. Everything matched. "Wind's holding," DeSantis said. She confirmed the sight picture, the northern saddle. The thermal signatures had settled, both stationary now. They were emplacing the weapon. "Talk to me," she said. "Stable," he said. "No change. Wind 0 at this end. You're clear." She took one more breath, let half of it out, let her body find stillness. The Carson Valley was completely quiet, 2.7 seconds. That was the flight time. From her muzzle to the target, at this range, at this atmospheric density, the round would travel for 2.7 seconds. In that time, the wind could change. The target could move. Anything could happen. She had built everything she could build. She had accounted for everything that could be accounted for. The remaining 8% was the valley doing what it wanted, and she could not control that. She controlled what she could control. Her fingers settled against the trigger, and then she fired. The rifle cracked. The sound broke apart against the ridgeline and scattered into the dark, and for 2.7 seconds the valley held its breath. DeSantis had his eye to the spotting scope. She stayed on her scope, watching the target area, waiting. The silence stretched, and then DeSantis said very quietly, "Direct hit." She didn't move for another 3 seconds, just lay there in the prone, breathing, letting her body process the information before she asked it to do anything else. The thermal signatures in the northern saddle were gone. Not relocated, gone. She exhaled slowly. "Confirm," she said. "Confirmed. Primary target destroyed. No secondary movement." He paused. "No return fire activity." She ejected the spent casing and indexed the bolt forward on an empty chamber. Kept her scope on the target area for another 90 seconds, watching for movement, for response, for anything. Nothing. The valley was still and dark and absolutely quiet, and somewhere 4 kilometers away, 12 soldiers were sleeping through the last hours before a patrol that was now going to be different. She picked up the radio. "Actual, this is Knox. Objective Kilo neutralized. 1 round. No secondary contact." Static. Then Fitch's voice, controlled, deliberate. "Copy that, Knox. Confirm engagement." "Confirmed. Direct hit. 1,838 meters." A longer pause than she expected. Then, "Copy. Stand by." She and DeSantis lay in their position for another 20 minutes, maintaining observation, while the FOB processed the confirmation. DeSantis didn't say much. He marked his observation log, noted the time, documented the atmospheric readings. At one point he said quietly, "That was the shot." She didn't answer. She kept her scope on the target area. 8502. Major Fitch came up on the net. "Knox, RTB at your discretion. Well done." She acknowledged and started breaking down her position. It was only when she was packing the rifle back into its case, working in the dark by feel alone, that her hands finally showed what the rest of her had been holding. A faint tremor, barely perceptible, gone in under 10 seconds. She zipped the case closed. DeSantis had already shouldered the spotting scope. He was looking at her in the particular way that people look at something they've just witnessed that they know they'll spend years trying to describe. "Ready?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "Ready." They moved back down the goat trail in the dark, and behind them the valley remained still, and above the eastern ridgeline the first edge of dawn had begun. Just barely, just a gray softening of the black, as if the sky itself was deciding how to respond. The fob was already awake when they got back. Not the normal pre-dawn awake, the generators humming, a few early risers at the coffee station, the quiet rotation of a facility moving through its overnight rhythm. This was different, lights in every building, movement between structures. The operations center windows bright against the dark, and through the glass she could see figures at the map tables, radios keyed, a cluster of personnel that had no reason to be assembled at 0530, unless something had happened or something was about to. Avery shouldered her rifle case and walked through the gate without slowing. The gate guard, a young specialist named Whitmore, who'd been on rotation for 3 hours and looked at, watched her pass with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not the usual nod. Something else. Like he'd been told to expect her. DeSantis fell in beside her. "That's a lot of activity for a confirmed kill." "Yeah," she said. "Good activity or bad activity?" She looked at the operations center. Through the window she could see Fitch, and beside him Hartman, and on the far side of the room, Briggs, standing separately, the way he always stood when he was processing information he hadn't finished deciding what to do with. "Don't know yet," she said. Fitch met her at the door. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and didn't particularly care that he hadn't. That specific combination of fatigue and focus that senior officers developed when an operation went right under circumstances that were supposed to go wrong. His eyes were clear. His voice was level. "Knox, come in." She set the rifle case against the wall inside the door and followed him to the map table. DeSantis came in behind her and went to the communications desk to log the observation data. The operations center had 5 people in it beyond the standard overnight staff: Hartman, Briggs, Kelleher, Torres, and a Colonel Avery hadn't seen before. Mid-50s, compact, with a 3rd Brigade patch, and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when they entered. He was looking at the map when she came in. He didn't look up immediately. Fitch said, "Sergeant Knox, this is Colonel Vance, Brigade Commander." She came to attention. Vance looked up from the map. He had the eyes of someone who'd been in the business long enough to have developed a specific look for specific situations, and the look he had right now was the one reserved for things that required his personal attention. "At ease," he said. "Tell me about the shot. Not describe the engagement, not walk me through the sequence. Tell me about the shot." The specific informal phrasing of someone who wanted the unprocessed version. She told him. No filler, no qualification beyond what was technically accurate. Range, atmospheric conditions, firing solution, the thermal confirmation from DeSantis, the single round, the result. She took 3 minutes. When she finished, Vance looked at Hartman. Hartman said, "Confirmed on the imagery. Brigade ISR Bird was overhead at the time of the engagement. We have the strike on record." Vance looked back at her. 1,838 meters. "Yes, sir." "In pre-dawn thermal conditions, with a compression wind variable you couldn't fully model." "Yes, sir." "First round." "Yes, sir." He nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when a thing they've been told turns out to be exactly as described, which is rarer than it should be. Then he looked at the map, at the eastern ridgeline, at the saddle marking, at the patrol routes that would step off in 43 minutes. The patrol elements are proceeding as scheduled. The time-sensitive target is still valid. This engagement cleared the path. He looked at her. 12 people are going to walk through that corridor this morning because of a shot you built the solution for 3 weeks before the mission existed. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "Good work," Vance said. He turned back to the map. The debrief was scheduled for 0900 after the patrol elements had stepped off and communications had settled. Avery used the intervening hours to sleep. Not well. The shoulder had flared during the climb back, and the adrenaline residue in her system made genuine rest impossible. but she got 90 minutes on her bunk with her eyes closed, which was enough to bring her cognitive function back to a level she could trust. She was back at the operations center at 0845. The patrol elements had checked in twice, both times clean. The eastern corridor was holding. The debrief room was small, a converted supply space off the operations center with a table, 6 chairs, and a projector that Hartman's staff sergeant had set up with the ISR footage queued and ready. Avery, DeSantis, Fitch, Hartman, Kelleher, and Briggs. Vance had returned to the brigade TOC. The room had the specific atmosphere of a professional post-action review. Focused, clinical, no performance. Hartman opened it. This is a formal engagement debrief. Sergeant Knox, Corporal DeSantis, please walk through the sequence from departure to RTB. They did it in order. DeSantis handled the movement and observation elements. Avery handled the firing solution and engagement decision. When they finished, Hartman asked clarifying questions about the atmospheric variables, the target confirmation sequence, the post-engagement observation protocol. Standard. Professional. Clean. Then Hartman paused, and the room shifted slightly in a way that told her the next question was the one that mattered. Sergeant Knox, Hartman said, the ballistic modeling you used in developing the firing solution. When did you begin building that? Approximately 3 weeks prior to the mission assignment, sir. Before you were briefed on the engagement requirement. Yes, sir. Based on terrain analysis from open-source data. Satellite imagery and topographic maps supplemented by my own observation during patrol accompaniments, sir. Hartman looked at Fitch. Fitch's expression was carefully neutral. And the intelligence analysis identifying the mortar crew's movement pattern, Hartman continued. The product you submitted to Major Fitch on day 11 of the deployment. Yes, sir. That analysis was initiated based on what, specifically? Anomalies in the patrol log cross-referenced against the mortar activity summaries from the previous unit, sir. I was looking for a firing solution corridor and noticed the timing pattern while I was working the terrain analysis. You found it while looking for something else? Yes, sir. Hartman wrote something. The room was quiet for a moment. DeSantis was looking at the wall. Kelleher had his notebook closed. Briggs said, how long had you been building the Carson Valley analysis before we deployed? She turned to look at him. His voice was level, not hostile. The question was genuine. She could tell the difference. Since the last week of Camp Redstone, sir. A beat. That's before deployment orders were finalized, Briggs said. The 3rd Brigade deployment window was on the operational calendar. The Carson Valley was listed as the area of operations in the brigade preparation materials. It wasn't classified. She paused. I started working the terrain because I knew that's where we were going, and I wanted to understand it before I got there. Another beat. Briggs looked at his hands, then at the projection screen where the ISR freeze frame showed the saddle position, then at her. At what point did you calculate that a sub-1,900-meter shot might be necessary? When I identified the mortar crew's positioning pattern, sir. The saddle is the only position in the eastern drainage that provides both overhead cover and a viable engagement arc on the patrol corridors. If they were going to hold a fixed position long enough to engage, it would be the saddle. So you modeled the shot before you knew the shot would be required? Yes, sir. Because you concluded the terrain would eventually force it? Yes, sir. The room held that for a moment. Fitch said, for the record, Sergeant Knox's analytical product identifying the enemy mortar pattern was submitted to Brigade S2 12 days before the engagement and has been assessed as operationally significant, independent of the engagement outcome. Hartman nodded and wrote it down. DeSantis glanced at her sideways. She didn't look at him. Any additional questions? Hartman said. Nobody spoke. Debrief concluded. The formal engagement report will be submitted through brigade channels within 24 hours. He looked at Avery. Sergeant Knox, the preliminary report already has your name as the primary shooter. That's the record. Understood, sir. Thank you. She was at her planning board that afternoon, updating the Carson Valley data with the post-engagement atmospheric readings, which would be useful for future mission planning regardless of anything else, when Torres appeared in the doorway. He had the look of someone who wanted to say something but hadn't sorted out the shape of it yet. Go ahead, she said, without turning from the board. The Brigade S2 section is requesting a copy of your terrain analysis framework, the full methodology. They want to use it as a template for area prep on the next rotation sector. She turned around. Which section head? Kelleher submitted the request. It's been approved up to brigade level. She looked at the board. At 3 weeks of work arranged on the wall of what used to be a supply closet. At the trajectory tables and the atmospheric models and the hand-drawn terrain sketch that had started as preparation and turned into something else. I'll have it formatted by tomorrow, she said. Torres nodded. He started to leave. Torres. He stopped. The morning after the shot, before the patrol elements checked in. She looked at him. How was it in the ops center? He thought about it. Quiet, he said. A lot of people standing around waiting for the radio. He paused. When you called in the confirmation, Sergeant Major Devereaux, he was visiting for the rotation review. He just sat down in a chair. Nobody said anything for about 30 seconds. She turned back to the board. Okay. He left. What? The problem started on day 3 after the engagement. She knew something was wrong before she had the specifics. She felt it in the quality of the silence around certain conversations. The way people stopped talking when she came within earshot, not the comfortable, familiar stop of people who'd already finished a thought, but the deliberate stop of people navigating something they hadn't resolved. DeSantis told her first, directly, because he was DeSantis. He found her at the range. She'd been running dry fire at 300 meters, keeping her technique calibrated, because she didn't know what was coming next and didn't want to go soft. And he came up beside her and said, without preamble, "There's a report problem." She lowered the rifle. What kind? The formal engagement report, the one Hartman said would go up within 24 hours. He paused. Kelleher told me this morning that there's been a revision. A revision. In the attribution section, the engagement is being credited to the unit's marksman element rather than to you specifically. She was quiet for a moment. On whose authority? That's the part Kelleher wouldn't say. She looked down the range, at the 300-meter target, small and precise in the morning light. Is the report filed? Not yet. It's still in revision. Who has it? Hartman's staff. But the revision request came from above Hartman. She stood there with the information and let it settle. Above Hartman meant colonel level or above. Vance or someone in Vance's staff. Which meant it wasn't a clerical error or an administrative confusion, it was a decision. Why? She said. DeSantis looked like he'd been sitting with his own version of that question for the last several hours. Kelleher's read is that someone above the brigade level doesn't want the optics of a designated marksman, specifically of who this particular designated marksman is, being the named shooter on a record engagement. She let the sentence sit. That's what he thinks, DeSantis said. He wouldn't say it directly. No. She picked up her rifle case. He wouldn't. Us. She went to Fitch. Not immediately. She spent 20 minutes walking the perimeter of the FOB in the afternoon heat, which was her version of thinking under conditions that didn't allow for sitting still. By the time she knocked on Fitch's door, she knew what she was going to say and how she was going to say it, and she'd made the decision that the temperature of the conversation was his to determine. Come in. He was at his desk. He looked like he'd been expecting her, which meant he already knew. Sir, she said. Sit down, Knox. She sat. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his desk. Then he looked at her. I've seen the revision request. And? It came from a staff officer at division level, not from Vance. Vance doesn't know yet. He paused. At least that's my read. He may know by now. What's the justification in the revision request? Operational security, protecting the identity of the unit's technical personnel. That's not a real justification for removing a named attribution on a confirmed engagement. No, he said, it isn't. My name was on the debrief record. It's in your report. It's in DeSantis's observation log. The ISR footage has timestamps that cross-reference every piece of communication with my voice. There isn't a version of this that erases the documentation trail. I know that. So whoever requested the revision either doesn't know that or doesn't care. Fitch leaned back. Knox, what do you want to do? She looked at him. I want the report accurate. That's what you want. I asked what you want to do. I want to put the accurate documentation in front of whoever needs to see it, and I want it on record that I'm requesting the correction through proper channels before I do anything else." He nodded. He'd been sitting with this, she realized, working out what was defensible, what was navigable, which levers existed and which ones would break things that couldn't be unbroken. "I'll request a review meeting with Vance," he said. "You'll need to bring your documentation, all of it. The original analysis, the engagement record, the communications log. I have all of it." "I know you do." He looked at her. "Knox, whoever sent the revision request has access to channels I don't. I don't know how far up this goes or how invested they are in the revision." "I understand that, sir." "Do you understand that pushing back on this could create friction in places you can't see from here?" She held his gaze. "Sir, I'm not pushing back because I want credit. I'm pushing back because the record is wrong, and if the record is wrong, then the methodology I used, the analytical framework, the ballistic modeling, all of it, gets credited to a collective unit designation and not to a named source. Which means when the next soldier in this role tries to do what I did and asks how it was done before, the answer is, the unit did it, and there's no trail to follow." Fitch was quiet. "That's the actual cost," she said. "Not my name, the methodology. Future soldiers lose access to a documented approach because someone decided the optics of accuracy were inconvenient." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll set up the meeting," he said. Vance was not what she'd expected. She'd expected a colonel who was being asked to reverse a decision made by someone in his chain of command to be defensive about it. The specific defensiveness of an officer who didn't want to acknowledge that his staff had done something that needed undoing. She'd seen that posture before. It involved a lot of deliberate eye contact and careful language. Vance walked into the meeting room, Fitch's office, the three of them, no additional staff, sat down and said, "Major Fitch told me the issue. Show me the documentation." She spread it on the desk. Original terrain analysis with timestamps, engagement communication logs, DeSantis's observation record, the ISR cross-reference that Hartman's staff had provided, her personal data cards dated from Camp Redstone through the morning of the engagement. He read. He was thorough. He didn't rush. He went through each piece in order, and when he had a question, he asked it and waited for the full answer before moving on. It took 40 minutes. When he finished, he stacked the documents and looked at the wall for a moment. "Who submitted the revision request?" he said. Not to her, to Fitch. "Colonel Alderman's staff, sir, Division G3. "Alderman," Vance's expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders did. "Is he aware of the documentation trail?" "I don't believe so, sir." "Then he'll be made aware." Vance looked at her. "Sergeant Knox, the formal engagement report will carry your name as primary shooter. The analytical products that preceded the engagement will be attributed to you by name in the supplementary record. The revision request will be withdrawn." He paused. "This won't be a comfortable process. Division doesn't enjoy being corrected. I understand, sir. I'm not asking for your understanding. I'm telling you what's going to happen, so you're not surprised when the discomfort comes." He looked at her directly. "You've been in the Army long enough to know that accuracy sometimes costs more than the people who are accurate expect to pay." "Yes, sir." "Are you prepared for that?" She met his eyes. "The record needs to be right, sir." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. A single, definitive nod. "It will be." The discomfort Vance had predicted arrived in the form of a phone call between Vance and Alderman that nobody was present for but that everyone in the TOC somehow knew about by that evening. The content wasn't shared. The outcome was visible in the way the revision request disappeared from the pending queue in the brigade administrative system the following morning. Hartman submitted the corrected formal engagement report at 0900. Knox, A. Primary shooter. Confirmed engagement, 1,838 meters. Single round. Pre-dawn thermal conditions. Variable atmospheric environment. She saw it on a copy Fitch passed to her that afternoon. She read it once, confirmed the attribution, confirmed the methodology section, referenced her analytical products by document date, and handed it back. "That's right," she said. "I know," Fitch said. "Him." Briggs came to find her that evening. She was at her planning board, updating the framework for Torres, as she'd promised. When she heard his boots on the stone floor of the corridor and recognized the specific weight of his step, She'd been hearing it for 6 weeks. He stopped in the doorway of the supply room. She didn't turn around. "Knox." "Sir?" A pause. "Do you have a minute?" She set down her pencil, turned around. He looked. Different was the only word that fit. Not smaller, not defeated. Different. Like a man who'd arrived somewhere he hadn't planned to arrive and was working out what to do now that he was there. He came into the room. He didn't sit. There was nowhere to sit. So he stood near the door and looked at her planning board, at the trajectory tables, at the hand-drawn terrain sketch, at the atmospheric data she'd been building since Nevada. "When you first showed up at Redstone," he said, "before the first qualification shoot, you were on the range at 0510. "Yes, sir." "I noticed. I didn't say anything about it." He paused. "I'd already decided what you were." She waited. "I'd seen the processing paperwork. Female sergeant, ranger support element, good service record. I'd seen that profile before and made a call about what it usually meant." He looked at the board, not at her. "I was wrong." She said nothing. "Not wrong about the profile, wrong about you specifically." He turned to look at her then. "I put you in cold slots. I extended your debriefs. I sent you that note about the ruck." "I know." "That note was unprofessional." "Yes, sir. It was." He absorbed that without flinching. "I made your evaluation harder than it needed to be. Not so hard that it would have showed on paper, but hard enough to matter." He paused. "You still finished first." "Yes, sir." "And then you built something out here that—" He stopped, started again. "What you built here. The analysis, the firing solution, the way you connected information that no one else connected." He shook his head slightly. "I've been in this work for 14 years. I've seen good shooters. I haven't seen that." She looked at him steadily. "Is this an apology, sir?" He held her gaze. "Yes." A moment of silence. "Accepted," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just accurate. He nodded once. "For what it's worth, what you said in the review meeting about the methodology, about future soldiers needing the documentation trail." He paused. "That's the right thing to fight for. Not the name on the report, the trail. That's what I was fighting for. I know that now." He looked at the board one more time. "I didn't know it at Redstone. I should have." He turned and walked out. She stood in the supply room for a moment after he left, in the particular silence that follows a conversation that moved something. Not resolved, moved, which was different and in its own way more real. She turned back to the planning board, picked up her pencil, and kept working. 3 days later, at morning formation, Major Fitch read a unit commendation citation that attributed the Carson Valley engagement to Sergeant Avery M. Knox by name, noted the intelligence analysis that had preceded it, and referenced the analytical methodology as a contribution to brigade preparation standards. The formation held 61 soldiers. They heard the citation in silence. When Fitch finished reading, he looked up from the paper and said, "Sergeant Knox, front and center." She walked forward and stood in front of the formation. Nobody laughed. Nobody smirked. DeSantis, in the second rank, stood slightly straighter than formation posture required. Murakami, 3 positions down, kept his face forward and still, which was his version of a great deal of feeling. Torres, near the back, looked like someone watching something he wanted to remember. Fitch presented the citation. She accepted it. She shook his hand. Then she turned around and faced the formation, and 61 soldiers were looking at her with the particular expression of a group that had processed new information about someone they thought they already understood. Some of them were working through the math, calculating what kind of preparation, what kind of discipline, what kind of quiet accumulation of work had produced what they'd heard in the citation. Some of them had already done the math and were sitting with what they'd concluded. She held the formation's gaze for a moment. Then she walked back to her position in the rank, tucked the citation under her arm, and stood at attention for the rest of morning formation like it was any other Tuesday. Because the shot was done. The report was right. The methodology was documented. What came next was a different problem, and she was already thinking about it. The next problem arrived 11 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. Not from Alderman's staff at Division, not from Briggs, not from any of the friction points she'd been monitoring. It came from a brigadier general named Mercer, who visited the FOB as part of a command assessment rotation and spent 40 minutes in the operations center before asking, with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having casual authority, why the Carson Valley engagement report carried a sergeant's name as primary attribution on what was being described in division circles as a generational-level long-range engagement. She wasn't in the room when he asked. She heard about it from Fitch, who recounted it with the careful neutrality of a man who was still processing his own reaction. He wasn't hostile, Fitch said. He was skeptical. He wanted to understand the attribution. He asked if the documentation was solid. What did you tell him? I told him it was the most thoroughly documented engagement submission I'd seen in 14 years of service. He paused. Then he asked to see it. She looked at him. And? He's in the reading room right now, sir. Brigadier General Mercer took an hour with the documentation. Avery spent that hour at the Eastern Observation Post, not because she'd been told to go there, but because standing inside the wire waiting for a general to finish reading her work was not something she could do without moving. The OP gave her a task: atmospheric observation, wind pattern logging, the ongoing maintenance of situational awareness that her role required regardless of what was happening in the command structure. She logged 3 wind readings and updated her data card and watched the eastern ridgeline and tried not to think about what 47 pages of documentation looked like to a brigadier general who'd come in skeptical. It was Torres who came to get her. He appeared at the OP access point at 11:40 and said, "General Mercer is requesting to speak with you." She closed her data card. "How did he seem?" Torres considered that. "He was on the phone for about 20 minutes after he finished reading. Then he asked for you." She picked up her kit. "Okay." Mercer was standing at the map table when she entered the reading room. He was a compact man, silver-haired, with the particular posture of someone who'd spent decades in the profession and had stopped performing it a long time ago. No theater, no projection, just the actual substance of the thing. He looked at her when she came in. "Sergeant Knox." "Sir?" He gestured to the chair across the table. She sat. He remained standing, which she noted, not as a power dynamic, but as a physical habit. Some people thought better on their feet. "I've read the complete documentation package," he said. "The terrain analysis, the mortar pattern identification, the engagement record, the atmospheric modeling." He paused. "The trajectory tables you built at Camp Redstone." "Yes, sir." "Walk me through the decision to begin the Carson Valley analysis before deployment." She walked him through it, the same way she'd walked Hartman through it, then Vance, then the documentation reviewers. Direct, technical, no embellishment. The open source data, the terrain recognition, the instinct that had preceded the formal problem. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You built a firing solution for a mission that hadn't been assigned, targeting a position that hadn't been identified, for a threat that hadn't been formally assessed." "Yes, sir." "And the solution was accurate?" "Yes, sir." He looked at the map on the table, at the Carson Valley overlay, the patrol routes, the engagement geometry. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in this work for 31 years, he said. "I've seen 3 soldiers who did what you did. Built ahead of the problem, not reacted to it, built ahead of it." He looked at her. 2 of them are colonels now. One of them is dead, which was bad luck and not a reflection of the approach. She held his gaze and didn't say anything. "The revision request from Alderman's staff," he said. "Yes, sir." "I spoke with Colonel Vance. I understand he resolved it." "Yes, sir." "Colonel Alderman will be addressed separately." He said it the way you'd say a fact about weather, informational, without particular heat. That kind of revision request on a documented engagement of this significance is not an administrative error. It's a judgment call that reflects poorly on the officer who made it. She kept her expression neutral. "I appreciate the correction to the record, sir." The record needed to be correct. He straightened. "I'm here because I want to discuss what happens next." She waited. "The analytical methodology you developed, the terrain pre-analysis, the atmospheric modeling, the pattern identification framework you used to assess the mortar crew's behavior. I want it formalized. Not as a unit product, as a named individual contribution to brigade and division preparation doctrine." He looked at her directly. "Your name on the methodology, your work attributed to you, in the permanent record." The words landed in the specific way that significant words land, not dramatically, but with weight. That process will take time, she said. It will take several months and significant bureaucratic patience, yes. He almost smiled. You'll be involved in the formalization process. I'll assign a doctrine officer to work with you. Sir, I'm a sergeant. Doctrine formalization is typically handled at— I'm aware of the typical process, he said. I'm adjusting it. He looked at her steadily. The methodology is yours. The formalization should carry your fingerprints. That's how it becomes useful to the next person who needs it, rather than becoming a generic institutional product that loses the specific logic that made it work. She sat with that for a moment. Understood, sir. Good. He picked up his cover from the table. One more thing, Captain Briggs. She looked up. He submitted an addendum to the evaluation record at Redstone last week, a formal revision to his assessment notes, acknowledging that his early evaluation of your capabilities was inaccurate and that his conduct during the evaluation period fell below the professional standard he should have maintained. He paused. He requested that the addendum be placed in the permanent evaluation file. I approved it. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. I'm telling you because you should know it exists, Mercer said, not because you asked for it. I didn't ask for it. I know you didn't. He put his cover on. That's part of why I'm telling you. He walked out. She sat in the reading room for a moment after he left, alone with the map table and the documentation spread across it, and the weight of the last several minutes settling into something she didn't have a clean word for. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too simple. Something more complicated. The specific feeling of a thing being completed correctly, which was different from a thing being won. She gathered the documentation into a neat stack and left it for the record's NCO. Holloway called her 2 days later. Not a formal call, a personal one, routed through the FOB Communications Center because the international connection required military channels. His voice had the slightly flattened quality of long-distance military communications, but the cadence was unmistakably his. Heard you had a busy deployment, he said. Word travels. Word travels fast when it's unusual. A pause. Mercer called me. She hadn't known they were connected. In retrospect, she should have. Holloway had appeared at Redstone as a brigade observer without announcement, and brigadier generals didn't typically maintain direct lines to retired master sergeants without a reason. He told me what he saw in the documentation, Holloway said. He told me about the revision request. Resolved now. Yeah, Mercer resolves things. Another pause. You held the line. The record needed to be right. I know why you did it. I'm telling you it mattered that you did. His voice was quiet, steady. The 14 soldiers I mentioned, the ones with your kind of preparation. You said 3 of them got where they deserved to go. That's right. What happened to the others? A longer pause than she expected. Some of them made the same choices you made, but at the wrong moment, with the wrong people in the room, and it cost them. He paused again. Some of them got tired. Not of the work, of the weight of doing it while carrying everything else that comes with being the person people have already decided you are before you open your mouth. He paused. It's exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. She looked at the wall of her supply room, at the planning board, at 6 weeks of preparation and 11 days of deployment that had produced something she couldn't fully see the shape of yet. I felt it, she said. I know. It didn't stop me. No, he said, it didn't. She could hear something in his voice, not pride exactly. The specific register of a man who'd been carrying a debt he hadn't been able to repay and had finally seen part of it cleared. It didn't stop you. They were quiet for a moment. The doctrine work, she said. Mercer's assigned a doctrine officer. I heard. It's the right call. It's going to take months. Good work usually does. A pause. Knox, when you come back, if you want to talk through the formalization process, I know how that machinery works. I spent 4 years in a doctrine development role at Leavenworth. She filed that away. I'll take you up on that. Good. He paused one more time. Don't stop building. It was the second time he'd said it. She thought it would probably be the last time he needed to. The deployment rotation ended 6 weeks after the engagement. The unit redeployment process was the standard bureaucratic compression of weeks of operational activity into a series of handover briefs, equipment accountability checks, and final reports. Avery spent the last 4 days ensuring the documentation transfer was complete. Her analytical framework, the terrain studies, the atmospheric modeling data, all of it formatted for the incoming unit's intelligence section, with clear methodology notes that would allow someone who'd never met her to follow the logic. She spent a morning with Torres, walking him through the pattern identification methodology. He was a fast learner. He asked the right questions, not the questions that confirmed what he already thought, but the ones that poked at the assumptions. If the sample size was larger, he said, looking at the patrol log analysis, would the pattern have been more obvious earlier? Possibly, but larger sample size means more patrol events, which means more time for the pattern to cause harm before it gets identified. She looked at the framework. The goal isn't to wait for certainty, it's to act on probability when the probability is high enough. What's high enough? That's a judgment call. You use the data to inform the judgment, but the judgment is still yours. She looked at him. Don't wait for 100%. You'll never get there, and while you're waiting, something moves. He wrote it down. Torres, she said. He looked up. Keep doing this after I leave. Even when it doesn't produce anything obvious, even when it looks like you're just generating paperwork. What if the next analyst thinks it's excessive? Show them the Carson Valley engagement report. If they still think it's excessive, find a different analyst. He almost smiled. Yes, Sergeant. The formal commendation ceremony was held on a Thursday morning in a courtyard at the main brigade installation, 2 weeks after redeployment, on a day that was cold and clear in the way that late-season days in that part of the country sometimes were, bright without warmth, the light doing more than the temperature. It was a small ceremony by military standards. Colonel Vance presided. Hartman was there. Kelleher. DeSantis in his dress uniform, standing straight, with the specific expression of someone trying to look like he always looked when he was actually working harder than usual. Murakami, standing beside DeSantis, doing it better. Fitch was there. Briggs was there. He stood in the second row of the assembled officers in dress uniform, and when Avery's name was read, he looked at her with an expression that had shed everything complicated about it and arrived somewhere simpler. Not absolution. You didn't get there that easily, and she didn't need to give it. Just the clean, uncomplicated look of someone seeing a thing accurately, finally, without the filter of what they'd expected to see. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked forward. Vance read this commendation. It was thorough. Engagement specifics, the analytical contribution, the documented methodology, the formal note about the preparation that had preceded the mission. He read it without embellishment, which was the right choice. The facts were sufficient. When he finished, he looked at her. Sergeant Knox, the United States Army is commending you not only for an exceptional act of marksmanship, but for the preparation that made it possible. That distinction matters. He paused. Anyone can be lucky. You were prepared. He presented the decoration. She accepted it. Her hand was steady. Afterward, in the informal gathering that followed the ceremony, coffee, the slow dispersal of uniformed personnel, the transition from formal to the human space that follows formal, DeSantis found her first. He handed her a coffee cup. How's the shoulder? He said. She told him about the shoulder on the descent from the OP that morning. Not much, just the factual acknowledgement that it had given her trouble on the climb. He'd absorbed it and not commented because that was DeSantis. 7 out of 10, she said. Same as always. Same as always. He looked at the courtyard, at the dispersing crowd, at Vance talking with Hartman, at Briggs standing slightly apart with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. What are you going to do with the doctrine work, he said. Build it right. It'll take time. You have time. I have time, she agreed. She looked at the courtyard, at the people in it, at 12 months of accumulated weight that had started with a bus ride through the dark and a staging area where someone had picked up her rifle without asking. DeSantis. Yeah. The morning of the engagement, on the way back down the goat trail. She paused. You said, that was the shot. I remember. What did you mean? He thought about it. Not a long time. He was a fast thinker, and he'd had weeks to sit with the memory. I meant it was the one, he said. Not the hardest shot, technically. Not the longest anyone's ever taken. He looked at the ground for a moment. The one where everything you'd built up to that point either worked Or it didn't. And it worked. He looked at her. That's what I meant. She looked at her coffee cup. Yeah, she said. That's what it was. Murakami said nothing at the ceremony, which was his way of saying a great deal. But as the gathering dispersed and the courtyard emptied, he crossed to where she was standing and stopped beside her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same middle distance she was looking at. Then he said, "The next evaluation cycle opens in 4 months." She looked at him. "They're looking for experienced designated marksmen to serve as cadre." He said it without particular inflection, the way he said everything. "Range instruction, evaluation design, working with the next generation of candidates." She hadn't heard that. "Where'd you get that?" "Holloway mentioned it. He said he thought you might be interested." She looked at the courtyard, at the building where the evaluation board had sat, and where her name had appeared at the top of the composite list, and where none of it had felt like enough at the time, because she'd already known she was going somewhere more specific. "He told me to tell you," Murakami continued, "that if you're going to build the methodology into doctrine, the best place to embed it is in the people who are going to use it, not the manual, the people." She thought about that, about Holloway's 14 soldiers, about the 3 who got where they deserved to go. About the rest, ground down by the weight of it before the work could land. About the evaluation range and the cold early mornings, and the candidates who'd ask questions instead of jokes after the scores went up. About Torres, writing down her explanation of probability thresholds in a notebook he'd carry to the next deployment. About whoever came after Torres in whatever valley, looking at a terrain problem and needing to know how to think about it. The methodology wasn't hers because she'd invented it. It was hers because she'd built it, tested it, refined it under pressure, and documented it when someone tried to erase it. The next step was obvious once she looked at it straight. "Tell Holloway I'll call him," she said. Murakami nodded. He walked away without another word. She found Briggs before she left. Not intentionally. She was crossing the parking area toward the vehicle that would take her to the transit terminal, and he was standing beside his own vehicle, keys in hand, not moving toward it. Like he'd walked to his car and then forgotten that the next step was to get in. He looked up when she approached. She stopped. They were 10 feet apart. The courtyard sounds were behind them, a distant conversation, someone's radio, the ordinary background noise of a military installation going about its day. "Sir?" she said. "Knox." He paused. "You heading out?" "Transit's at 1400. He nodded. He looked at his keys, then at her. "The addendum to the evaluation record. General Mercer told me." "I know he did." He paused again. "I didn't do it for your benefit. I want to be straight about that." She waited. "I did it because it was accurate," he said. "Because the evaluation file should reflect what actually happened, not the version of it I was carrying when I wrote the original notes." He looked at her steadily. "But I also did it because I want the next sergeant who shows up at an evaluation with a file, I don't expect to carry a record that shows what happened when an evaluator made assumptions and what those assumptions cost." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a harder thing to write than an apology." "Yeah," he said. "It is." She held his gaze. "For what it's worth, you gave me fire authority when it mattered. You could have found a reason not to. I had the data in front of me. A lot of people have data in front of them and still find reasons." He absorbed that. "I almost did," he said. "Find a reason." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind about whether it was possible?" "The shot. At some point between the evaluation and the engagement, you decided it was within reach." "I decided it was within reach at Camp Redstone," she said. "I just didn't have the specific problem yet. That's—" He stopped. Started again. "That's a different way of operating than I've seen." "It's the only way I know how to operate," she said. "You see the terrain, you build for the conditions, you wait for the problem to arrive." He looked at her for a long moment. "And if the problem never arrives? Then you have preparation you didn't need." She picked up her bag. "That's not a loss." She walked to her vehicle. She didn't look back. Not because she was making a point, just because the transit was at 1400 and she had what she needed, and looking back wasn't the direction any of it was going. The flight home was long and not particularly comfortable, which was standard. She slept for 3 hours somewhere over the Atlantic. Real sleep this time. not the maintenance rest of operational necessity, but something closer to the actual thing, the deep absence of a body that had been running at capacity for months and was finally being allowed to stop. She woke up over the eastern seaboard with the shoulder aching at a 6 and her mouth dry, and the specific disorientation of waking in transit that took a few seconds to resolve. She looked out the window. The cloud cover had broken. Below, she could see the patchwork of the landscape: farmland, highway corridors, the dark shapes of forests and rivers. She reached into her jacket pocket. The commendation citation was folded there, the paper slightly worn from being carried rather than stored. She didn't take it out, just felt the shape of it. 12 people had gone on a patrol one morning and come back at the end of the day and gone to their bunks and probably complained about the food and argued about whatever soldiers argued about, and had no idea that the margin between that ordinary day and a different kind of day had been measured in 2.7 seconds and 6 weeks of preparation and a supply closet full of handwritten data cards. That was the thing nobody's ceremony covered, the gap between the citation language and the actual texture of it. The gap was where the work happened, and the work was invisible by design. Preparation always was, until the moment it wasn't. She put her hand back in her lap. Outside the window, the landscape moved beneath her, ordinary and vast, full of people who'd built something and were waiting for the problem that would tell them whether it was enough. She called Holloway the week she got back. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting her. "Murakami said you'd call," he said. "He was right. He usually is." A pause. "The cadre position. I'm interested." "I know you are." She could hear him settling into a chair somewhere. "It's not easy work. The evaluation candidates are going to look at a sergeant with a commendation and assume the story's simple. You'll spend a lot of time explaining that it wasn't." "I know. And some of them won't believe you because people who haven't felt the weight of it have trouble understanding why it mattered." "Some of them," she said. "Not all." A pause. "No," Holloway said. "Not all." She looked out the window of her apartment, the first apartment she'd been in for months, with its familiar particular silence and the view of a parking lot that was somehow still a comfort after a long time away. The ones who are going to do this work the right way, they'll be there. They'll be the ones who show up at 0510 and build their own data cards and don't stop when people tell them it's not how it's done. "You think you can find them?" "I think they'll find themselves," she said. "I just need to make sure the environment doesn't grind them down before they get the chance." Holloway was quiet for a moment. She could hear the specific quality of his silence, the kind that meant he was holding something. "That's why I stayed in as long as I did," he said, "to make the environment less stupid for the people who were going to matter." "Did it work?" "Sometimes." A pause. "Maybe 3 out of 14. She smiled at that, not happily, but with the precise recognition of someone who understood the math. "I'll take better odds than that." "Good," he said. "So will I." 4 months later, she stood at the front of the evaluation briefing room at Camp Redstone. Different candidates. 61 this time, from across the force, seated in the same folding chairs in the same room with the same projector that still threw the image slightly left of center. The same smell of industrial cleaner and old wood. She'd declined the option to stand at the cadre line during opening remarks. She'd asked to deliver a portion of the brief herself, which had required a conversation with the evaluation director that had lasted longer than it should have, but had ended correctly. She stood at the front of the room with her hands in front of her, not behind her back, not gripping a podium, just standing. 61 candidates looked at her. Some of them had looked up her name in the database. She knew that. It was what she would have done. Some of them had read the engagement report citation and formed a picture that was probably simpler than the actual thing. A few of them had read enough to understand it was more complicated, and those were the ones she was most interested in. She looked at the room. "The evaluation is going to tell you how well you shoot," she said. "It's designed to do that. The metrics are solid and the cadre know their work." She paused. "What it's less good at telling you is how well you think before you shoot. How you build a firing solution when you don't have all the data. How you identify a problem that hasn't been formally assigned to you yet." She paused again. "That part is on you." The room was quiet. "You're going to have 6 weeks," she said. "Use them the way they're designed and you'll qualify. Use them the way they're designed and also use the time nobody's watching. the 0500 hours, the evenings, the gaps in the schedule. And you'll build something that goes past qualifying. She looked at the room, at the faces in it, at the specific collection of people who had shown up here for their own reasons, carrying their own histories, having already been told a specific set of things about what was possible. Some of you have already been told this job isn't for you, she said, by someone who decided before seeing you work. I'm not going to tell you that person was wrong, because sometimes they're not. But I'm going to tell you that the way to answer that question is not to argue about it. It's to build your data card and show up at 0510 and do the work until the work speaks for itself. A pause. Because targets don't care about opinions, she said. They only respond to precision. And precision is built in the hours nobody sees, long before the moment that everyone remembers. She looked at the room one more time. At 61 people who were going to find out what they were made of over the next 6 weeks, and some of whom were going to discover it was more than they'd been told, and some of whom were going to be the ones who came back in 10 years to tell the next group. We'll begin the range brief in 15 minutes, she said. Get your documentation ready. She stepped back from the front of the room. The candidates began moving. Notebooks opened. Pens came out. Someone near the back was already pulling out a data card. Handwritten, dense with notations, built before arrival. She looked at that candidate for a moment. Then she walked to the observation point and started reading the wind. Preparation is invisible until it isn't. The work that nobody sees is the only work that matters when the moment arrives. And the moment always arrives for the people who are ready for it.